Hello, my creative friends, and welcome to another episode of The Daily Prompt. My name is Jeff Ballo. I'm an independent producer trying to build an independent film studio, taking you along for the ride, trying to help each day, giving you some sort of tip or advice or perspective or blow your mind or something more practical and tangible along the way to help you achieve whatever goal you've set out for yourself as well. Today is actually the fourth day in the process of us reverse engineering the complete creative process from idea to the story to the screenplay to the sale to connecting with the producer. So if we look back over the past couple of days, the first episode, I can't remember the number, 15? I don't know, was we basically start with the end and we determine who is the producer. How do we go about connecting with your idea, your screenplay, the ultimate thing that you create, with its ultimate target? This person is going to say yes to the project and actually go out and make that. So we looked at that in the first episode. Once we realize what we need an aligned screenplay. Then we take that one step back in the process and we say, how do we actually align a screenplay? Well, we get notes and feedback and understand how our work is landing with the reader. So we use that to change and adapt our work so that it can land the way that we want it to land. But now, how do we go get those notes and feedback in the first place? Well, the way we do that is by ensuring that we have created a page-turner screenplay. We literally polish and refine the project so that as soon as a reader picks it up, they will not be able to put it down because it is that solid, it is that grabbing, it builds throughout the entire process. If you actually create screenplays that when someone picks them up, they cannot put them down, they will be super excited about reading your projects, they will be super excited about giving you notes and feedback. And the notes and feedback itself will be better than if you're not able to do that, because they can go deeper into how it affected them and what it meant and some of the sort of more nuanced elements of the story. Whether this is a professional person giving you feedback or whether it's, just a friend or family. So before you can polish your script into a page-turner screenplay, your story actually needs to be solid. One of the biggest challenges that I have seen writers face along the way, I used to run into the problem too, which is that you have that idea, you sit down and you start blasting out your project, and as you start to go, you reread what you've written, and you go back and you start fiddling with the words and trying to make it perfect and trying to build and create something extraordinary as you go along. So what I've figured out along the way is that writing is actually a 4-part process. First, we have to develop the story, then we have to put it onto the page, then we have to refine it until it's the story that we had in our imagination, and then we polish it and turn it into that extraordinary screenplay. So if we're working backwards, we have that payoff phase, we have that alignment phase, we have that tweak, polish phase of the previous episode, and then prior to that, we actually have to do the rewrite itself. Now, one of the reasons rewriting is so hard for everyone is that everything in screenwriting, everything in storytelling, absolutely every aspect of it is interconnected in an even bigger way than you think. So in any story, the nature of the character is going to determine what choices the character makes. So the plot, literally the twists and turns of the story, are going to change depending on who the character is, because a different character would make a different set of choices in this situation, which would take the story in a different direction. So in the same way that story and structure, character and plot, the same way that those are sort of two sides of the same coin, so therefore inextricably interlinked, you can't change one without affecting the other in some way. So when you start to rewrite something, you make a little change over here, it unravels all this stuff over here. So the biggest challenge that I have found along the way for writers is that rewriting becomes the death knell of your ambition, because once you blast out that dream, it's all fun and games to create the story, blast it onto the page, and have a draft ready to show somebody. One of the reasons writers don't like to dig into the rewrite process is because as soon as you start changing one thing here, all of a sudden everything else changes, and then you don't know, well, should I make this change? There's literally an infinite array of options for every one of the choices that you make, and they all have this sort of flow-on effect. So when I realized that this was such an enormous problem for writers in general, for me personally as well, I realized that we had to come up with I wanted to come up with some sort of systematic approach to the rewrite process. And as I sat down to try to sort of map it out, I thought, what is going to be the most powerful way to get writers through this melange of ideas, this chaos of possibilities? If you just start rewriting haphazardly, you go through word by word, line by line of your screenplay, and you get partway in and you go, actually, this should be a little bit better over here. And you keep going and go, this should be a little bit better over here. As you keep going like that, you're going to find that you're thinking about this scene and you're not thinking about sort of the rollout consequences of those changes throughout the rest of your story. So how can we approach this from a sort of systematic way of dealing with the chaos of the rewrite? And what I came up with was what I call the strengthen phase. Ultimately, if you think of rewriting as strengthening your story, not necessarily rewriting it, because rewriting means to write over, to do again, right? So it would make sense that you don't want to rewrite your story ad nauseum infinitely, right? If you blast out a draft in 3 days and then you rewrite 100 times, that feels like you're churning in circles. If instead you think in terms of strengthening what you have. So I have this quote that it came up with along the way somewhere, which is that there is no such thing as a bad screenplay. There is only early drafts. Right? So if you read or write a bad screenplay, something that's just not interesting, not engaging, doesn't take the reader along on an interesting ride, doesn't give us any reason to care about it, it's not the end of the day. If you actually pinpoint what's not good about it, you can go dig in and improve those things and then have a new draft that maybe is a good screenplay. In fact, I would argue that almost any great screenplay that exists or that you've read started out with probably some early drafts that weren't all that hot. Now, if they come from an experienced writer who's a bit of a master at doing all this stuff, maybe their early drafts were stronger than yours might be if you're just starting out. But they all start out in a lesser form than they end up. So let's use that logic to figure out how to reverse engineer rewriting. And so the approach that I came up with was, if you think of a rewrite, what are we basically doing? We're basically taking a weak draft and turning it into a strong draft, or at least a stronger draft than the weak draft. If you say you're going to have to, do 10 drafts or 15 or 100 drafts of your project to get it to what you want it to be, each iteration, each draft is still going from what you have to a stronger version, to closer to what you want. So if we think of the rewrite process, we can think of it not just in terms of fixing problems in your story. We can really think of it in terms of iterative improvement in the work that you've written. So what is the ultimate goal? The ultimate goal is a solid story. The ultimate goal is whatever that movie was or evolves to become in your imagination. That's the goal. That's what we're trying to create in the draft. Now, it's possible that as you start to make changes to your script, what you're going to end up with is not that solid final project. You may go down some dark corners and go down some crazy roads that you end up with pages and pages that are just not actually getting you closer to where you want to be. That's not a problem, because as part of the creative process, going down those empty roads and those going around the corner and not finding the goal that you were setting out for is actually part of the discovery process. If you think of storytelling or turning your idea into an effective story as a process of discovery, if you think of it as a process of discovery, then ultimately it doesn't matter if you're going down some wrong avenues along the way. That's actually part of the process, because now you know which road not to take, which is going to help highlight the road to take. So if we think of the ultimate goal here as a solid story, the idea you imagined in your head affecting the reader in the way that you want to affect the reader, if that's the ultimate goal, then what we're trying to do is get to whatever draft you have right now to that goal. So how can we go about doing that? What I've basically come up with is thinking of your story or thinking of your rewrite as 6 levels, right? So what we basically have are 6 different levels of the project. So the biggest, widest level is what I call the big picture level. This is sort of the point and the purpose of the story itself. You can look at every detail in your story and hold it up against that big picture and determine whether we're actually getting where we want to go. Now, a lot of that is contextual. Maybe you've created a scene where technically this detail is getting us where we want to go, but the overall scene's impact isn't. So your first pass, or the first level that you want to look at is that big picture, the point and purpose. Inside that level is what I call the whole story level. In other words, if you have the big picture, what's the point what's the message you're trying to get across, or what's the feeling you're trying to convey in your story, whatever that thing is that you're trying to convey through your story. The story itself, what happens in the story, who's doing what, who's pursuing what, whatever it might be, is the expression of that big picture, right? So if you were going to say the big picture is it's better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all, your whole story, the things that are going to happen in your story must express that big picture, right? So if we determine what the whole story is, the way you're going to demonstrate better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all is a twin storyline, one character who has loved and one who has never loved at all, and how they sort of come together at the end. That's your way of telling that story. So there's the whole story level. The next layer the third level, is what I call the act level. And these are the main sort of movements of your story. So the big picture things, they start out on this path. They discover the person, they pursue the person, then they move into the next act where they get the person and they build a relationship, but it starts to fall apart. And then they have the climax at the end where the two characters come together and see whether it was better to have loved and lost. That kind of a thing, right? So understanding what your major movements of your story are, that's the act level. Now, beneath the act level is what I call the scene level. The scene level are the individual scene components that make up the act. So if you're focused on each of the individual scenes that make up the act, you can look at, are these scenes actually serving this act? Is that act then serving the whole story? Is that whole story then serving the big picture? So in that way, there's this sort of cascade effect between these layers. Now, the next level down is what I call the dialogue level. Now, the dialogue, this is particularly in screenwriting, the dialogue is sort of the window to the character. The dialogue is one of the sort of surface level ways that we're going to connect and engage with the characters as they go through this. So the dialogue has to serve the scene, has to serve the whole story, the acts, the whole story, and the big picture. And then the deepest level, the finest point level is what I call the experience level. This is the experience that the reader is going to have as they go through your story. Is the experience going to give them the picture of the whole story and the big picture? Now, I'll go into more detail in some of this stuff in future episodes of the show. But the key to understand is that my approach and my suggested approach to you to the rewrite process is, don't just look at a script and go and start digging in from page 1 and figuring out how to fix your project, because you're not going to be able to see the threads and how they interconnect and interact and affect one another and become choices that will unravel your whole story, or choices that don't ultimately then end up making your story any better or improving what you're setting out to improve. If instead you look at the rewrite itself as a process where you're going to go through these 6 levels, then what happens is, as you start to make changes at each of the levels, you'll start to be able to see the cascading effect that those changes have on the other levels. So when you start the rewrite, the beginning of the rewrite, you know where you're trying to get to, you know where the draft is right now, and you're basically trying to make your way from here to there. By going through one level at a time, what you're effectively doing is closing in on every detail in your draft to see how every detail affects and impacts upon the other levels of the story. Once you've sort of made that experience that gives the reader the moment-to-moment experience of your screenplay, gives the reader the experience that you're trying to get and ultimately says what you're trying to say, that's when you're finished with that draft. So if you take the rewrite process and you go level by level through your draft to improve it, then at the end of going through each of those levels and making the changes and rewriting your project according to this sort of approach and model, what you end up with is a new draft. And once you have that new draft, you then can look at that draft and you can say, is this the story that I wanted to tell? Is this the story that's solid? Is this the story that by fine-tuning it and polishing it, turning it into a page turner, is going to grab a reader and take them on the journey I want them to go on? So so that's ultimately the goal. Maybe you get to the end of a rewrite and you go, nope, we're not quite there yet. What do you do then? You take it through this process again. You start with the big picture, you go to the whole story, you go to the act level, you go to the scene level, dialogue level, and the moment-to-moment experience of the story. So in that way, every time you go through the rewrite, you're going through the rewrite systematically. You're going through the rewrite thoroughly. You're covering your project with a fine-tooth comb. You're making sure that every little aspect of your story is solid and is contributing to those ever larger levels of what you're trying to get across. To understand this completely, you need sort of the rest of the process as well, because ultimately, a story exists to say something. A story exists for some sort of point or purpose. You're putting a message out there, you're showing your interpretation of the world, you're showing the meaning of certain character choices or certain situations, and it's that meaning that you're trying to get across to the audience. If your approach to rewriting doesn't very specifically address what the ultimate point and purpose and goal of your story is, you're going to end up in this chaotic world where you've rewritten a scene 30 times. There's 6 of them are possibly a good way to go about it, but how do you know which way is right? How do you know which way is best? How do you know which way is the most effective? The way you do that is you go through the rewrite process systematically. In that way, you can start with any draft. You can start with a draft that you haven't been able to figure out in the past, and you can go through that process and strengthen it. And you can make that draft more in line with what you're trying to achieve and what you're trying to say. If it's your first draft, you can go through this process an endless number of times if you want to iteratively increase and improve your project. You do that until your project is solid. Once your project is solid, once it's what you want it to be and it's saying what you want it to say, then you go and fine-tune the actual read. You pull the reader's eye down that page so that it's a page turner, so that when they pick it up and they start reading, they cannot put it down. And every little thing in the story is building that picture that you're creating for them. Once you have that, you start sending that out for notes and feedback. That's when you're going to get people eagerly reading your work. If people start eagerly reading your work and giving you notes and feedback, the better quality your writing is, the better the quality the feedback is going to be. You're then going to be able to dig into the nuances and make sure that the choices you make and the character and you've described the situation and the story that you're unfolding in the reader's imagination is something that grabs them. If you can achieve that, then knowing that your project lands the way you want it to land, then you are ready to find and connect with that ideal producer. So you see how just asking, how do I sell my screenplay, is way too early in the process. If you have not completely and thoroughly refined that project, there's no point in trying to reach out to a producer or a production company. If you have not aligned your project, there's no point. If you have not turned it into a page turner, if you have not then solidified that project before you even try to turn it into a page turner, and yet 90+% of screenplays that get submitted in the world, even from professional level writers, by the way. I'm tired of people saying, oh yeah, beginners, novices. I'm talking about professional level screenplays as well do not hit these marks because writers are following predictable formulaic approaches to storytelling. Well, as someone who understands the formula, I can predict that stuff. I'm not going to get the emotional enjoyment out of it. If you as a writer are writing one of those things and you know that, then you understand my journey as the reader. Then when you go through this process of rewriting, you're focused on my experience as well, and you can shape and reshape and adjust and contour the project so that it gives me an experience I've never had before and takes your story to the next level. So ultimately, there's going to be much more to talk about in the rewrite process. Don't worry, we're just reverse engineering the process right now, guys. Don't worry that you don't have all the answers yet to all the questions you might have. If you understand the process that we're reverse engineering here, hopefully you can see the power of what having a systematic approach to rewriting is really going to give you as a writer. Hopefully you can start to see how that is also part of the answer to how do I connect with a producer. That everything's interconnected. The rewrite process is part of the process of becoming a professional writer, the process of actually selling your work, of getting an agent in the first place, right? If you don't have this skill, this talent, this system, this creative framework guiding your work, that stuff is not going to happen because you're not ready for it, because you're not thinking through the importance of how it lands with the reader and why you need it to land a certain way with the reader. So please take this on board. Please take this to heart. To turn this into a little bit of a daily prompt for you, I want you to look at whatever you've written so far in this project that you've started with me on this journey, or a project that you've tried to write something in the past. I want you to think about how looking at rewriting as a process, as a 6-level strategic process, can take what you've written before and strengthen it and turn it into something better, more powerful, more poignant, more to the point of what you're trying to get across, whatever it might be, than the draft that you currently have already. If you haven't started writing yet, you're not yet ready for rewriting. Let me write something before I go think about rewriting. Then what I'd like you to do is I'd go find a script online, look at something that exists and think about, what is this trying to be? How could we make that stronger? And then I want you to think about those 6 levels. We're going to go into much more detail about all this stuff as we go through this series. So don't worry that if you don't quite understand all 6 levels completely. But if you have sort of an overview understanding of them, have a look at how those levels apply to whatever it is that you're writing. Or just use this as sort of inspiration, as a realization that it doesn't matter how bad your first draft is. It doesn't matter how bad your 20th draft is. As long as you keep taking action, as long as you take your draft and turn it into something stronger, as long as you strengthen that draft and keep taking action, keep moving forward, you can get where you're trying to go. Most writers do not do this. Most writers barely rewrite at all. Or if they do rewrite, it's that page by page thing and they're rewriting in the dark. They're not strategically, actively, step by step, trying to improve their work so that it lands with the reader the way they want it to land with the reader. If you start doing that, you're going to get a whole lot further than you have so far. So, when you're finished with this video, comment, ask questions. I'm here to help. Whatever you need to know, whatever you want to know, we will cover it all. So ask questions, comment, read the comments, read the things that I say to other people. There's value in the comments here. Read the comments, discuss it with me. Stop after this. Think about it, process it, filter it through your own thing, and then go take some action. 10 minutes, 1 hour, 10 hours, it's up to you, but take action today. And we'll see you tomorrow.